Okay, so everyone can see I'm taking up the whole screen. I can see. Yeah,
There you
brilliant.
go.
Okay, so pleasure to be here. Thanks for welcoming me. As you can see, the title of the talk is your bank account a force for good or bad? In most people's case, unfortunately, it's bad. So that's the area that we're going to focus on. And then we'll obviously discuss as well, how you can align your money more with your values by shifting deposits to banks like the Co-op, where your account would be a force for good. So this is a quote that we've rallied behind at Bank Green since we were founded, from Bill McKibben, who's the founder of a very influential climate movement called 350. And it's money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns. So just try to keep that in mind as we go through the rest of the presentation. Quick intro, you don't really need one because I was already provided one. It was very accurate. Broadly speaking, in my mid-30s, decided I hadn't really contributed anything of positive social value into the world. So it was about time I did that. Gradually got involved with the climate movement on the digital side, and then eventually in late 2020 splintered off with a group of rebels from the rebellion, and we founded Bank Green, and it's been a great journey since then. Since our launch in April 2021, so we're still volunteer-led. We are seeking funding, but without funding, we've managed to achieve these metrics, which is 150,000 website visitors. Over 250,000 times the visitors have checked their bank's climate impact, 3,500 email subscribers, 2,500 pledges to switch to a greener bank. And so far we have, I think, a bit more now than 20 members of what we're calling the Fossil Free Alliance, which you alluded to earlier, which is a group of institutions who've gone on record as stating that they have no exposure to the fossil fuel industry. And we've had a campaign collaboration, as Dan is well aware, with the UK's best known ethical bank. And we've managed to earn media in The Guardian, Forbes, and various other publications. But who are we and what do we do? Well, largely we are a sort of consumer advocacy organization with a bit of campaigning sprinkled in there for greener banking practices. And we're trying to kind of highlight and strengthen the banks who are already doing the right thing, and trying to kind of shift the center of gravity, if you will, of the banking ecosystem towards more sustainable practices. And consumer empowerment and education is a big part of how we go about that. So what do banks have to do with the climate crisis in the first instance? Well, they're really the economic engines of society. Nearly all companies and business sectors depend on banks for working capital. Through their finance or their conditions of finance, they can impact the behavior of companies in all other business sectors in the economy. And amongst the many companies that they do support, of course, are fossil fuel companies who are directly responsible for the production of greenhouse gas emissions. So what are the ways in which they do this? There's three principal ways. One is they provide financing. So they offer loans to fossil fuel companies, and they underwrite their bonds and share issuance when they're IPOing. They provide more general services like M&A type services if their companies want to merge or they need advice on how to, how to merge and so on. And through their asset management arms, they also invest clients' money in fossil fuel companies. Of these three services, it's financing that far and away provides the most support to fossil fuels, and it's responsible for, I think, around 90% of the working capital of these fossil fuel companies. So it's a really critical part of their survival. And because of that, there is a lot of work that goes into trying to uncover the true extent of the financing. And there's this report that comes out once a year. The most recent one was just a couple of months ago, and it's called Banking on Climate Chaos. And it basically tracks all of the financing of the world's 60 largest banks to the fossil fuel sector. And it even looks at subcategories of it looks at overall fossil finance by bank on aggregate. And then it looks at subcategories like Arctic oil and gas, offshore drilling, tar sands, those kinds of things. And it's painstaking research that's put together in a very nice visual format, because the banks obviously don't want their customers to know about this, so they try and brush it under the rug and talk much more about their sustainability commitments, which are quite thin in many cases. And so it needs you know, these NGOs to come in and do the work. And what they uncover every year is frankly pretty shocking. And a lot of what bank.green does is try to sort of present this information to consumers in a sort of easily digestible format. And the big kind of headline statistic each year is what is the total amount of financing of these loans and underwriting that has been provided since the Paris Climate Agreement. And in the most recent update, it came out as $5.5 trillion, which when you crunch the numbers comes to around almost £2 billion per day since the Paris Agreement. So quite a shocking statistic there. And sadly for us, it's showing no signs of slowing down at the moment. So this is the kind of trend line since the Paris Agreement, where you can see until 2021 at least, it was just up and to the right, and somehow that they were providing more financing 5 years later than just after the Paris Agreement was made. There was a bit of a blip in 2020 due to COVID. And you might take heart in the most recent number, which is $668 billion, but for the fact that when you dig a bit deeper, you realize that there was a dip last year, and it was mainly due to a fairly unique set of kind of geopolitical and economic conditions. The main one being the war in Ukraine, and whereby due to energy shortages and stuff, and the price of oil rising, that these fossil fuel companies managed to rake in record profits. I think it was $4 trillion for the year, and therefore they managed to pay down a lot of the loans that they had already received and had less of a need to take out new loans. But the bank exclusion policies barely changed at all. There were no massive changes, so there's no reason to suspect that the trend won't continue as some of those other forces begin to abate. So we'll have to see next year if that's true or not. But it's not as positive from this graph as it might look at first. Who are the biggest culprits? Well, in the US, you have JP Morgan, who since the Paris Agreement are far and away most responsible for all of this mess. And then in Europe, you have Barclays with 191 billion since the Paris Agreement, HSBC not far behind, and a few French banks sprinkled in there as well. And the interesting thing to note is that although each of these banks pour tens of billions of US dollars into the fossil fuel industry every year, it's still a pretty meager fraction of their total portfolio. So it tends to be between 2 and 15%. In most cases, I believe it's below 10%, which tells us, firstly, that banks don't need the fossil fuel industry to make a profit and survive. But the fossil fuel industry do need banks for working capital. And so that kind of suggests an area where we can exert some leverage. And obviously, I'm going to address that a little bit later in the talk. So this graph looks a lot more complicated than it is. Just to try to kind of put the nail in the coffin, as it were, of the kind of outrageousness of what these banks are up to. We call them fossil banks. It's the fact that not only are they financing the maintenance of the fossil fuel infrastructure, but about 40% of this money that they receive goes towards the expansion of the fossil fuel, of exploration and development of fossil fuels. And the reason that's such a bad thing is shown quite neatly in this graph. So if we're trying to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming or global heating, as outlined in the Paris Agreement, then roughly speaking, we have, as of about 2 years ago, we had about 500 gigatons of CO2 left to emit to stand a 50-50 chance of staying below. If we want to stay below a catastrophic 2 degrees, then we have about 1,000 gigatons of CO2 to emit, and that's represented on the right. And then I think we have a 66% chance of avoiding it, kind of thing. So it's not a certainty in either of these cases, but if we hit those limits, then it becomes much more likely that we'll reach those thresholds. And then on the left, what you see is the already developed reserves of fossil fuels. So that would be the maintenance side. Those are fossil fuels that have not just been approved, but they've already gone into their life cycle, and are going to be burned unless some sort of drastic action is taken, right? So if we just look at that, you can see that with all the world's existing reserves of fossil fuels, we're already going way above the 2-degree carbon budget, which screws us, to put it bluntly. And so then when you find out on top of this that banks are actually making significant investments into finding more fossil fuels and deep sea drilling and all this kind of thing, you're like, well, how does this make any sense? How can this be allowed? And so that, leads to the only logical conclusion, which is that the end to the climate crisis requires the end to the fossil fuel industry, starting with fossil fuel expansion, which requires an end of finance to the fossil fuel industry, which begins with banks. So that takes us back to banks. And actually, there's a body called the International Energy Agency, which has typically been a sort of pro-fossil fuels advocate, who were commissioned by the United Nations a couple of years ago to draw out a couple of energy scenarios. And their conclusion was that there can be no further expansion of fossil fuels if we're to stand any chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. So that was a pretty key statement, I think, that a lot of policymakers have hopefully, taken under advisement, but that kind of remains to be seen. So now that I've depressed everybody with all the doom and gloom, what can we do? And is there still hope? I guess is the question we're probably all wondering. Yes, there is. Don't worry, I'm not going to disappoint you. But a lot needs to happen, to put it mildly. So what can we as individuals do? Well, the first thing is that you as an individual, your voice does matter. Banks do listen to their customers. They're responsible. They're sort of the backbone of many of these banks' revenue models. I mean, the significance of their retail divisions kind of varies bank to bank, but it's an important piece of their operations and their revenue. So, just like with any company, if enough customers kick up a fuss, they're gonna take notice. So, if only for selfish reasons and thinking about the bottom line. So that's one way that your voice matters. And of course, the more that we can group together, the louder that chorus becomes, the more likely it is we will be able to affect change. And quite aside from concerns about profit, they're also concerned about their reputations, because there's a whole cohort of customers that they haven't acquired yet that they're wanting to. University graduates, younger kids, like it's usually younger generation who haven't maybe opened their first bank account yet. And so, if their name has been smeared in the press for being, very for sort of accelerating the climate crisis, and then that is something they're going to pay attention to. So quite apart from the amount of actual divestment that takes place, the more that we can kind of get the ball rolling on a sort of consumer power movement, the more likely we'd be able to affect some of this kind of reputational risk that would also get them to change policies. There is historical precedent for this. So going back as far as 1970 to 1986, there was the anti-apartheid movement, where Barclays were very involved in South Africa with lots of investments there. And it was UK university students actually that raised the alarm bells and began this protest movement where thousands of accounts were closed, lots of AGMs were disrupted, and that eventually led to Barclays finally, after a very long struggle, doing the right thing and pulling out of South Africa. More recently, there's been the Go Fossil Free campaign backed by 350.org, which was the movement I mentioned at the very beginning with a quote with Bill McKibben, where local communities have been petitioning their institutions to divest from fossil fuels. And I think in recent years, I think they've counted over 1,000 of institutions have succumbed at least partially to this grassroots pressure and have actually divested. So it can work. More recently, a few years ago, there was a Greenpeace-led campaign where Barclays customers threatened to switch their accounts over some of their tar sands investments, 6,000 of them. Sadly, in this case, Barclays didn't remove the investment, but HSBC at the time, so I was told, made a press release talking about how they're not quite as bad, or something to do with their sustainability investments or something like that. So it obviously got under the skin of some of these bigger banks, and the feeling is that if we did more of it in larger numbers, that we could actually finally kind of knock the wall down, as it were. So what are the actual practical steps that you might be able to do to contribute to this kind of grassroots pressure? Well, obviously there's the general kind of applying of a pressure, and there's a few different ways to do that, and I'm going to come on to in a minute. As a bank customer, a very powerful way, and one that we're strong advocates of, is to actually switch banks and move your money to banks like the Co-op, banks like Triodos, Ecology Building Society. There's a large swathe of banks that are just divested, and then there's a smaller group who are actually doing the opposite of the fossil banks, and where you can actually be confident that your deposits are being put towards building a greener future. So that's kind of the ultimate goal, is to move your money away, and that's a strong sign of protest towards your bank. And then finally, if you're not up for doing either of those things, for whatever reason, and there are some legitimate reasons for that, we really encourage people to share the message. And so I'm going to talk about each three of these in a bit more detail for the second half of the talk. So the first one is applying pressure. How would you do that? Well, we're really in favor of calling your bank, because banks, they don't get many calls about climate. So yours will definitely get them to sit up and hopefully take some action based on your discussion. And the reason it works so well is because they trigger these kind of internal feedback processes where the call gets logged. Often the bank staff will talk about it amongst themselves, and then they get hoisted up the flagpole, to the higher ups. And of course, for one person doing that, then they're not suddenly going to, end all of their loans to fossil fuel companies. But again, it's about turning the trickle into a waterfall, and building the pressure alongside campaign groups, alongside regulation, all these other aspects as well, that are all completely necessary. And the other thing is, calls are very immediate, and the bank representative has to, take your call seriously and talk to their colleagues about it. And, as I said, it triggers that kind of internal process. So, they're used to getting calls about, oh, I can't log into my account, or, I can't, why is my overdraft fee so high, or that kind of thing. So when they actually get something about the climate, they're really likely to pay attention. And you might often find that the person on the other end of the line was completely unaware as well of what their own bank is up to. And so, in the very best cases, you may even spur some kind of questions from their own employees, which of course they will also take seriously. How to do this? Well, calling the standard customer service line is great. But we find what really helps is if you can reach out to their investor relations line, because that's a small group of people, senior executives, that have kind of a direct line to management, and are also likely to be more up to speed with the kind of the investments and the policies you talk to them about. You can usually find that on their website, especially if it's one of the biggest banks like the Big Four in the UK. And then another tip is to sort of keep in mind what the goal is of calling. It's either to ask about their fossil fuel policies, if you don't know them yet, so that's completely legitimate. It can be an investigative kind of call. Or if you already know some of these numbers, which you can find on our website, then you can, explain that to them and tell them you're not happy about it, and they need to do better, and that you want somebody to get back to you about this. So it is helpful to have some talking points in front of you. Again, we have them on the site. There's also a sister website of ours called fossilbanks.org that has the most up-to-date information on any particular bank, if you put it in there, on the sort of dirty deals that they're doing and the amounts that they're financing and their exclusion policies and all that kind of stuff. So that will kind of help to, make the call go a bit more fluidly. And we advise that to avoid long wait times, that you should call at the beginning or the end of the bank's business hours. So that's just kind of a general tip, so you don't get demotivated by long wait times. And I think the most important thing that I've already touched upon is that you need to make sure the call is logged, because else it's too easy for them to get off, and someone will just move, go about their day as if you never called. But you need to ask for it to be logged, and really you should push them for a response as well. And it's a little bit more effective if you're actually, if you are a customer of the bank, but it's actually fine as well if you're not. It's a very valid form of activism, I think, just to call a bank in general and just say, as a member of the public, as a prospective customer, I'm a concerned citizen. Why are you doing this? So don't be discouraged from calling if you've already switched, to a good bank. Okay, so I've actually covered most of these points in the last slide. I apologize for that, except the nerves one. Nerves are normal. It's completely okay to be a little bit nervous. It shows the person on the other end that you're a human being, and that you're calling because you really care. And it may even spark like a very genuine conversation with them. We're trying to spark a grassroots movement, and those are formed through kind of human to human interactions. And that can be exactly what happens here, and by sort of transmitting to them your concern in a very kind of genuine way, you're more likely to get them, to spur them to actually do something about it themselves. Okay, so that's calling. And the second form of action we advocate is switching banks. So not everyone is in a position to switch today, because they might be stuck in a mortgage or have some other financial product, or just very busy for the next few months. So on our website, we have a pledge form that you can fill out, and we'll remind you and send you follow-up reminders to stick to your pledge that you're going to switch. And also, the greater we can swell those pledge numbers, the more ammo we have, to go to the press, for example, and try to instigate something similar to what Greenpeace did that I showed you earlier. So pledging is great. Even if you are going to switch today, by all means, fill out the pledge form. Switching itself, we have steps on how to do that on the website. We have a kind of extensive list of, we call them SFIs, Sustainable Financial Institutions, that we recommend within the UK and other countries, but we're focusing quite exclusively on the UK at the moment. And then once you've done it, same thing as with the call, you need to tell your bank why you left. It's not enough to just leave, because they'll see you on a huge list of customer account closures. And if you didn't give a reason, then there's no there's no real not validity, but they're not going to know, and it's not going to have the same impact, even remotely, if you don't express that to them. So make it very clear you're not happy with their policies. You're not happy with the fact they're endangering your future, your children's future, and you expect better from a mainstream bank. And that's just a small screenshot there of the recommendation section of our website. You can see the Co-op there, and Triodos are two of our Fossil-Free Alliance members. If they don't have the seal yet, that doesn't mean that they're not divested. They most likely are. It just means that we're probably still talking to them or reaching out to them. We're actually about to begin a fairly extensive outreach campaign to other institutions in the UK to try to grow the numbers in the UK of the Alliance. And then the third way of taking action is to share the message. It's super important, as I just mentioned, about grassroots movements, people talking and getting the ball rolling and changing the public discourse. And everyone has the power to do that. So talk to your friends and family. There's a huge awareness gap in the UK especially, but also in the rest of Europe and the US. Namely, there was a recent survey where 80% of Barclays and HSBC customers were unaware of their bank's fossil fuel funding record. I know the Co-op also recently did some research around this. And that's a pretty staggering lack of awareness, if you ask me. So by sharing the message as extensively and vigorously as you can, we can help to close that. And that's going to have all kinds of beneficial, knock-on effects in terms of who people bank with, how they think about money, who they vote for. Maybe that's what gets someone into climate activism. You never know. So that's something that we as kind of nodes on this network can help to bring about. And when they found out, 12.5% of those same customers, which represented millions of people, said that they were very likely to switch banks. So we can help to increase those numbers. Other than just talking around the dinner table, social media is a great way to spread the message. A lot of people are fans of coming on our website and tweeting about their shock when they've seen how their own bank stacks up. So these are some screenshots of that. Similarly, if you're already banking with one of the better banks, then we encourage people to boast about that, because you're still spreading the message indirectly that this is the standard that should be met. And if your bank falls below, then you should change. So social media is a very good way. And do remember to mention your bank if you do it on Twitter, for example. So it actually brings it to their own attention as well as their potential customers. Oh, so, yeah. Sorry, this was the second half. Yeah, this is people boasting about having switched. So you've got someone, Herbert, here saying, I just swapped from NatWest to Co-op. Thanks to being enlightened by your campaign. Thanks for the nudge. I've just requested to shut my HSBC account down. I'll be moving over to Triodos. I switched from Lloyd's, etc., etc. So this is all really, really good stuff. Something else that you can also do that we occasionally engage in is called green trolling. So when you get the bigger banks having, tooting their own horn about their sustainable initiatives, you can always make sure that it's balanced by an appropriate amount of tooting their horn for them about all of the fossil investments that they make as well, because that's what they always conveniently ignore from the conversation. And so, yeah, we reimagined one of their ads here that said, we finance and advise companies, to we finance and advise fossil fuel companies. And we got lots of engagement, lots of laughter about that. So that's just another idea. Okay, so we've now covered the three main ways that you can take action on this information. What do you do from here? Well, the first thing is, if you haven't already, you can come on our website, and on the homepage, the very first thing you see allows you to check your bank score, which has recently been updated with the latest information from the Banking on Climate Chaos report. Then you can decide, of the three ways that I laid out, which is the type of pressure you'd like to apply the most. And then you can share the message repeatedly from now until we have a very different banking system with everyone you come across who is not going to reject your message for being too preachy. And if they do, then we have blog posts about how to deal with kind of climate skepticism or people who don't really want to hear about it, how you can kind of make them more attuned to the importance of this issue. We do also have a section on the website, bank.green/volunteers. I need to look over it again, but we have sort of specific roles that we're looking for help with at the moment. So if you want to get even more involved, then of course we would very much welcome that. One thing that we're working on that we're the most excited about, but it's going to take probably the longest to come to fruition, is a type of sustainability audit that we're doing ourselves of these banks. And of course, many of them exist already. Ours is going to have a slightly stronger focus on this issue of fossil fuels. And it involves a little bit of artificial intelligence. We have some pretty strong engineers on our team, but it also requires some human intervention, because I don't know if you've been reading about ChatGPT or any of these AI tools, but at the best of times they can be a little bit hallucinatory and get things wrong. And so it would be a bit of a mistake to release something like this into the wild without having some human intervention. And we're going to be looking for volunteers to help with that as well. So one thing that it will be doing, amongst others, is to kind of analyze a bank's sustainability policy and extract the relevant parts for our purposes, and then we would need a human to read them to sort of double check that the conclusion it reaches is correct or not. And so sort of a hope through this initiative is to eventually be able to kind of assign a score or a multi-dimensional score to some of these banks, which will help even more for people to kind of make the right assessment of whether their bank is doing the right thing, whether it's green enough, and whether they can be confident that their money is in the right place. So yeah, that's it from me for now. Thank you for listening. I think ultimately, we're all climate concerned citizens and we want to do the right thing. And I think a great way that we can do that is to just try to shift money out of the broken system and into ones that banks like the Co-op are helping to promote, where your money is going to be accelerating a more sustainable future that we know is the future that's coming. We know it's the one we need. But if the banks themselves, the bigger banks, are not changing their behavior fast enough, then one of the best things we can do is to keep promoting the ones that are doing the right thing, and so that we can bring that future forward by as many years as possible, and sort of negate those negative impacts in doing so. So yeah, that was it. Sorry if it was a bit longer than 20. I wasn't counting, but